We've got 15 minutes of a discussion between the three of you, so I'll pass back over.
I'd like to take up one thing that actually, was it Naeem? She's gone, but never mind. She stressed that the UN had been useless, and Jeff repeated it. Of course, when the UN voted for recognition of the State of Israel, decolonisation hadn't happened, so there was only about 30 countries, and most of the countries that are now liberated, and seeing what is happening in Israel in their own history of being colonised, seeing all the parallels. It's the same in Ireland. People who've got, the vote in the General Assembly to uphold the ICJ opinion that said every country has a duty to require Israel to get out of the occupied territories and not be complicit in any way. 124 countries voted for that. Most of the world is against them. And we might not feel it here, but you must remember that. And the world is polarising around this question. Britain abstained. So, international... No, but they didn't even dare to vote against, if you know what I mean. They can facilitate the planes going through, but they didn't want to be seen to be doing that. So I think we should be careful. We can be critical of the UN for not having enough enforcement, but the coming together of all the people of the world, their countries, and making a stand, as they have been doing, is not nothing. And the International Court of Justice, of course, if our countries don't comply with it, they'll bust the whole system, which is a dangerous thing for all of us. So I just wanted to put to you, Jeff, we should be careful when knocking the UN, because we need the international law and holding everyone to it and so on. Don't you think?
Did anybody hear me knock the UN? I mean, I'm not crazy about it, but no, my point was we should expel Israel. Yes, from the UN. So the UN does have some clout.
And just to say, South Africa was expelled. There's a parallel.
That's right. Well, I guess one of the reasons why we wanted this panel, was because. Although I think things have changed, it's true, since October 7th, for all the horrible reasons that Nick mentioned, is that the question that we're dealing with is the same thing that Nick and everyone else dealing with social justice issues is, how does civil society affect government policies? So I don't know if 3 or 4 or 800,000 people coming out in London on weekends for Palestine has an impact, on government policy. I don't know. I know that 2 years now of thousands and thousands of Israelis going out in the streets. First of all, against this judicial reform project before October 7th. But then after October 7th, not for Palestine or for Gaza certainly, but for the hostage issue. But we've had almost 2 years now of massive protests, not only in weekends, I mean, all over, including at the house of Netanyahu and at the office and government ministers and so on, with absolutely no impact whatsoever. Because, it's different from here, but in our coalition government, Netanyahu has pretty much of a no confidence proof majority. So he doesn't have to listen to the street in a sense. So that's really the issue. Do we have, and the system we live in, the international system, has become very transactional. There's always been a transactional element to it, but certainly since Trump, and really certainly since the 1970s with the rise of neoliberalism. It's become much more transactional, and there's no more alliances. The whole idea of a rules-based international order is ridiculous, because the powerful countries don't want to be constrained by rules or by international institutions, which is why the UN is problematic, because the UN could be strong in a system in which genuinely there was a commitment to a rules-based international order and engagement, what the Chinese foreign policy is based on, which is engagement and a kind of a relation-based foreign policy. So, whereas the foreign policies we have are realpolitik and power politics of Kissinger, but even in those days, there was a certain strategy and a certain ideology and a certain, view of the future that we're completely lacking today. Today, it's all transactional with corporations and short-term and deals, the deal of the century, right? And there's no alliances and there's no values. And so the question is, in that kind of a system, how do we really affect things? There's almost no grounds on which we can appeal to the people in power, because what motivates them and what their policies are based on are short-term, reactive, and self-serving. So that, there's a complete, almost I feel more of a disconnect today between the people that we are motivated by justice and values and human rights. That does, look at it, brings everybody in the street. But it's not at all, it's almost laughable for governments. I think Jimmy Carter got laughed out of office because he wanted to make human rights a guidepost of American foreign policy. So that's really my question. How is civil society that is concerned about justice in Palestine able to engage with a transactionally based governmental system, an international system, in which really the values don't count, and in some ways I don't know if our influence counts at all. Yeah. And for somebody like Nick, who's engaged in global justice now,
Nick,
that's a real question.
Do you want to come in?
Well, shall we all just go home and commit suicide? Is it really true that we can't do anything? No.
I don't think so. You've got to, but there's got to be a political cost for what they're doing. We have to be able to inflict that political cost on them, right? And now, we did that a bit in the election. It's extraordinary. 4 seats Labour lost, safe seats, on this one issue, a purely foreign policy issue. That's really extraordinary, and you can argue about Corbyn and Carla in Bristol as well. It's a big effect on those, and there was nearly another 5 seats that went, including mine, Bethnal Green and Bow, including West Streetings. So, and that's an election where they would have wiped the floor, whatever happened. Right? The next election will not be like that. So our power coming up to the next election, I think, is going to be much greater. And I think there's got to be that. I've never believed in change happens by whispering in the ears of ministers, however well intentioned. And FDR got that right when he said to his base, right, I know what you think, I believe in it too, make me do it. Right? That's how power works. But I think with a government like this one in particular, they will only respond to the political costs. So we've got to drive that up as much as we can. I do also think, Jeff, as well, it's important, though, not to romanticize the past, right? When I saw some of those campuses go out and the militarization of American university campuses, you can't help but think of Vietnam. Right? Again, a conflict that cost millions of Vietnamese lives, but which sparked a movement, sparked the 60s counterculture in some ways, right? You can argue. Again, how do we get there? It's a long process, but it's a complex process, but I'm not sure the American government was any more willing to listen at that time to protesters until such a point that it just simply became, we made it impossible, they made it impossible to continue. And I think that's what we've got to get to as well. And I think particularly on this issue, I'd be interested to know what you both think on this as well, but it seems to me on this issue it is not simply an issue of, I know sometimes we present it, I do too, as this is a state which is entirely out of control and needs to be reined in and constrained in the rest of it. There's a bit of that, of course, but I simply don't believe it would have got to this stage if it wasn't the case that America in some ways sees its own interests as tied up with Israel, and Britain does too. And Britain does too, absolutely. And what I'm worried about at the moment, frankly, given all the language coming out of Lamy and elsewhere, is Iran is where they are heading with all of this, right? I think that's where we're heading. And I think, for me, Lebanon was a big moment where they invaded Lebanon, because it seemed to me that, that they decided, you've gone so far now, actually, how can this work for us? And it becomes about weakening Iran, and I think that's what we've got to be ready for. But that makes it harder, because that means their geostrategic interests are aligned, not just accidental.
I want to remind us we live here. Britain was put under enormous pressure, Harold Wilson, for us to send some forces to Vietnam. They wanted them tokenistically rather than like Australia did, and he didn't. We need to move just to a position as good as that. We won't sell arms. We will vote the right way in the UN, etc. We should move our country. That's the bit that's in our hands, and the politicians that might be scared of us. So, of course, we must take in the whole picture, but that's the bit we can do, and British people did it when Harold Wilson was there stopping us sending some of our troops and our boys to die and to kill people in Vietnam.
Yeah, thank you. I do want to come back in, Clare, on Nick's point about Iran and America and the UK seeing their interests represented by Israel, and whether there's anything we can do specifically to speak to that.
I think America, I think Israel wants to get America involved in attacking Iran. I'm sure that the UK, we're lieutenant to the US, that's now our foreign policy. Anything they want, we can do a little bit, and it shows we're still important. It's a very pathetic global role, and that needs challenging in general, quite apart from the hypocrisy. I don't think they can involve Britain in a war against Iran without things going really crazy. The other thing is we will get terrorism back on the streets. If you absolutely abuse a people and don't allow any remedy to justice, we're going to have some more of all that. And I will say one thing about the slap. The Provisional IRA slapped the British. The island's right next to Britain. You had the whole of the British Armed Forces. You had something like 200 young people with guns. But in the end, Britain negotiated. And there were some very ugly bombs. The Birmingham pub bombing. Oppressed people often do some pretty nasty things. But in the end, we negotiated. I don't like anyone being violent to anybody, but this is what happens in history. And we've got to get to the point where people want to negotiate a decent settlement and not allowing Israel to constantly breach international law is the thing that's in the hands of our countries that we could do.